They were just watering their front lawn. An elderly black couple, married for over 40 years, standing side by side in the neighborhood they helped build. No shouting, no crime, no threat. Their names were Harold and Lillian Brooks, 74 and 71, high school sweethearts who never left the block where they raised their children. Harold was a retired postal worker who knew every crack in the sidewalk from decades of early morning routes. Lillian had spent 35 years as a school secretary, remembering birthdays, calming nervous parents, keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. They weren't loud people. They didn't look for trouble. Their days were simple: morning coffee on the porch, tending to the roses in the front yard, waving at neighbors who had watched their kids grow up and move away. That house wasn't just property. It was history. Birthday parties in the backyard, graduation photos on the steps, holiday lights. Harold still insisted on hanging himself, even when his knees started to protest. That afternoon felt like every other one. The sun was warm, the lawn freshly cut. Lillian laughed at something Harold said as they adjusted a sprinkler near the sidewalk. But down the street, a patrol car slowed, then another. The laughter faded, because sometimes in certain neighborhoods, even a quiet life can be mistaken for something else. Then the patrol cars arrived. The first patrol car stopped directly in front of their house. Harold straightened up slowly, water still running from the hose in his hand. Lillian turned off the sprinkler, confusion replacing her smile. They hadn't called anyone. There hadn't been an emergency. Nothing was wrong. At least, that's what they thought. Two officers stepped out. Their expressions were tight, unreadable. They scanned the yard, the house, the couple standing quietly on their own property. A question came, sharp, suspicious. Did they live there? Harold blinked. For a moment, he thought he misheard. Of course they lived there. They'd lived there for over 4 decades. He gestured toward the house, toward the porch swing he built with his own hands. But the officers weren't looking at the swing. They were looking at him. Another patrol car pulled up behind the first. Doors opened. Radios crackled. One of the officers mentioned a report. A suspicious couple seen tampering with property. Tampering. Lillian felt her chest tighten. She glanced at Harold, silently asking the same question forming in her own mind. Suspicious for watering their lawn. Harold kept his voice calm. He always kept it calm. He explained who they were. He pointed to the address numbers mounted beside the door. He even mentioned their next-door neighbor by name, hoping familiarity would dissolve the tension. It didn't. One officer stepped closer, asking for identification. Lillian's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket. Harold felt something heavier than fear settle in his stomach: recognition. The kind that comes from knowing this moment isn't new. It's just happening again. Neighbors began stepping outside. At first, just curious glances from behind curtains. Then doors opened. A few phones lifted into the air. The officer's tone shifted from questioning to commanding. They were instructed to step away from each other, to place their hands where they could be seen, to turn around. Lillian's breath grew shallow. Harold's jaw tightened, but he complied. He knew how quickly resistance could be misread, how easily calm could be labeled defiance. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. Lillian gasped as her own hands were pulled behind her back. The sound of cuffs clicking shut echoed louder than the patrol car engines. The street fell silent. Harold stood there, 74 years old, hands bound in front of the house he paid off 20 years ago. Lillian's shoulders shook, not from guilt, but from disbelief. Across the street, someone whispered that this couldn't be right. But the officers continued, speaking into radios, describing them as if they were suspects caught in the act. Caught doing what? Watering roses. Within minutes, their hands were behind their backs. Cold metal cuffs tightened around fragile wrists. Neighbors stepped outside. Phones started recording. And the same street that once felt like home suddenly felt like a courtroom. The crowd was bigger now. Murmurs turned into louder voices. Someone insisted the couple had lived there forever. Another neighbor shouted their names. Yet the officers hesitated, uncertain but unwilling to back down. And in that fragile pause, between accusation and realization, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Because what happened next would decide whether this moment ended in quiet humiliation or something far louder. The handcuffs were tight, too tight. Harold could feel the metal pressing into his skin, cold and unforgiving. Lillian struggled to steady her breathing as an officer guided her toward the patrol car. She had never been inside one before. Not like this. Neighbors were no longer whispering. They were shouting. Voices rose from porches and sidewalks. Someone yelled that the couple had lived there for decades. Another neighbor stepped forward, pointing at family photos visible through the living room window. A man across the street began live streaming, his voice shaking as he described what everyone was seeing. Harold looked at Lillian. In her eyes, there wasn't just fear. There was something worse, hurt. The kind that comes from being treated like a stranger in a place where you've given your whole life. An officer reached for the patrol car door. And that's when the crowd moved closer. Not violently, not recklessly, but firmly. They weren't chanting. They were standing, and their presence changed the air. A woman stepped between the officers and the car, holding up her phone. Others stood beside her. Then more. The sidewalk filled shoulder to shoulder. Teachers, delivery drivers, teenagers, retirees, people who had borrowed sugar from Lillian and asked Harold for advice about fixing fences. The officers hesitated. Radios crackled again. Dispatch repeated the address, confirmed the homeowners' names, confirmed there was no active crime. The shift was subtle but visible, because suddenly, this wasn't just two elderly suspects in cuffs. It was an entire neighborhood watching injustice unfold in real time. And in that charged silence, with cameras recording and dozens of witnesses refusing to step back, the officers realized something powerful. They weren't the only authority on that street anymore. The handcuffs came off slowly. No apology, no long explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement from dispatch that the report had been misunderstood. The officers stepped back, avoiding eye contact as the weight of dozens of witnesses pressed in around them. Harold rubbed his wrists where the metal had left red marks. Lillian steadied herself against him, her hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the shock of it all. The same street that had watched them plant trees, host barbecues, and wave goodbye to their children had just watched them treated like criminals. The patrol cars drove away, but the silence they left behind felt heavier than the sirens. Neighbors surrounded the couple, offering hugs, anger, disbelief. Some promised to file complaints. Others promised to keep the video circulating. For a moment, Harold and Lillian weren't alone. They were held up by the very community that had just refused to let them disappear into the back of a police car. That night, the porch light stayed on longer than usual. Harold sat quietly beside Lillian, staring at the yard they had watered only hours earlier. The roses were still standing. The house still belonged to them, but something invisible had shifted. Because the truth is, they were handcuffed long before the metal touched their wrists. Handcuffed by assumptions, by suspicion, by a system that sometimes sees color before it sees character. This wasn't just their story. It was a reminder that silence allows moments like this to repeat, but unity can stop them in their tracks. So the question isn't just what happened on that lawn, but what those officers didn't expect was what would happen next. Because this time, the whole neighborhood was watching. The question is, when you see injustice unfold, will you step forward or step back?